Joe Biden, President of the United States, declared that Easter Sunday was Transgender Day of Visibility, and this came as a shock to a lot of conservatives and Republicans. Let me talk about this. The origin of the concept behind Easter actually starts with Passover, and I need to talk to you guys a little bit about that and the history in the early church before we dig into the transgender stuff. When God brought together the people of Israel out of the land of Egypt, he gave them 7 feast days to celebrate, and all of those feast days had prophetic implications for the things that were going to happen in the future pertaining to them being saved. We have Passover, we have the Feast of Unleavened Bread, we have the Feast of First Fruits, then we skip to the summer feast of Shavuot, which is Pentecost, what most people know. Then we've got the Feast of Trumpets, Yom Kippur or Day of Atonement, and then the Feast of Tabernacles or Sukkot. These are the 7 feasts of God, and all of them pertain to activities that the Messiah is going to do. The first 4 feasts, the 3 spring feasts and the summer feast, have all been fulfilled by Messiah. We believe as Christians that Jesus, or Yeshua, came to fulfill those feast days already. Let's briefly walk through this process. So the Hebrew New Year begins in the month that the barley begins to ripen. It's called the time of Aviv or the month of Aviv, or it's sometimes referred to as the month of Nisan. It's the first month of the Jewish New Year. In Aviv, on the 10th day, the Israelites were instructed to set apart the lamb. Interestingly, it was on the 10th day of Aviv, or Nisan, that Yeshua, Jesus, rode into Jerusalem on a donkey, in fulfillment of the setting apart of the lamb for the sacrifice. On the 14th of Aviv, the lamb was prepared. The lamb would be sacrificed, and the people would eat of the lamb that evening as they went to supper. On the 14th of Aviv, Yeshua, Jesus, was crucified. He became a guilt offering on our behalf. Then on the 15th of Aviv, when the Feast of Unleavened Bread happened, so for 7 days people would not eat any bread that had leaven in it. It represented a removal of sin from among the midst of the people. And during this time, a special sacrifice was given before the Lord that did not have leaven in it. Now, Yeshua was the unleavened bread that went into the grave on our behalf. He had no sin in him. He represented the perfect offering before the Lord. Now, the first day of the Feast of Unleavened Bread was considered a high holy day, or a Shabbat. It was a Sabbath day of rest to the people, in addition to the regular weekly Sabbath. So we had that Sabbath day rest, then we had the regular weekly day Sabbath, and then we had the Feast of First Fruits. The Feast of First Fruits began on the first day of the week following the observance of Pesach, or Passover. So this would have been the Sunday. Now, Yeshua fulfilled the Feast of First Fruits when he resurrected from the dead and became the first fruits of the resurrection before the Father. He was the perfect offering of the first harvest, and the first harvest that's brought in Israel is the barley harvest. So this was representative of Yeshua. Now, unfortunately, as time progressed and more Gentiles grew and came to Christianity and came to follow Yeshua, their presence also drew with them a lot of anti-Semitism and a hatred for the Jews, whom they began to turn on and blame for the death of Yeshua. I mean, Yeshua's alive. We don't have to worry about any of that at this point. But unfortunately, that anti-Semitic behavior pervaded the church. And in the 300s AD, Emperor Constantine made a decree to set the date of the resurrection to always fall on a Sunday. So he decreed that the first Sunday after the spring equinox would be Easter, or Resurrection Sunday. And so the Christian church began to follow the Gregorian calendar, or the solar calendar, on the first Sunday following the spring equinox. Passover, on the other hand, begins 14 days after the new moon of the month of Aviv, as stated in the Torah, and this is why the dates do not always line up between Easter and Passover. If we are to genuinely stay true to what Scripture teaches about the death, burial, and resurrection of Yeshua, we ought to observe Passover, unleavened bread, and first fruits, which is when he genuinely did die, be buried, and was resurrected. And that is prophetic in the Lord's timeline of things. And these are 3 of the 7 holy feast days that the Lord gave his people, because it tells a story. And we miss out on that story when we don't know these things. Okay, so that being said, So what our modern churches today call Easter Sunday did actually originate with the original Passover celebration, unleavened bread, and first fruits. But over time, there has been this kind of infilling of pagan influence that has happened. And I want to talk about that as well, because this has implications for why the whole transgender announcement from Biden happened on an Easter Sunday. So it starts with the goddess Eostre, which is where many historians believe Easter actually got its name from. Eostre is also called Ostara or Istra. She is a Germanic goddess associated with the spring and the dawn. She's particularly known in Anglo-Saxon and Old High German traditions. Now, some people point out the fact that there's really not a lot of historical evidence about Eostre, but I would make the note that because most of the evidence that we have of her comes from Anglo-Saxon cultic pagan rituals, where they didn't have either a language for those rituals and they did not write them down. It was a lot of oral tradition. It's understandable why we don't have evidence. So there is a mention from Bede, who is a 8th century English monk and historian, very well-respected individual, and he noted that Eostre is the name of a month that corresponds with April, and he suggested that the festival of Easter was likely named for this particular goddess. He doesn't go into detail. That wasn't really his expertise in talking about goddesses. He was more of a science-type person, but that is historical evidence for her existence. So much like the goddess Ishtar or Asherah, Eostre was generally associated with themes of fertility, renewal, the changing of the seasons, hence why she was celebrated around the spring equinox. Her name is etymologically linked with words that are related to the dawn and the east, where the sun rises. There were known pagan sunrise festivals and observations that were made in her honor. She's associated with symbols of spring, eggs, hares, bunny rabbits, right? All of that is connected to her worship. So this is the critical point. Eostre is Ishtar. Ishtar is Inanna. It's an ancient Mesopotamian goddess of sex, war, and justice, okay? They have different names as the culture changed over time, but it's the same fertility goddess. And here's the kicker. Inanna was known to have this quote-unquote ability to change a person's gender. And the priests and priestesses that served in her temple, they underwent genital mutilation and changed their sex to serve her. Or some of them wouldn't go to those extremes, but they would dress as the opposite sex and pretend to be the opposite sex in honor of this goddess of sex. Okay? So we've got a transgender goddess who is also Eostre, pretending to be this happy-go-lucky fertility god of bunnies and eggs, and your kids are playing around with symbols of an ancient fertility goddess, and at the same time, the President of the United States is declaring the day to be a Transgender Visibility Day, which is literally what this goddess does, is make these people visible in their service to her. It doesn't surprise me. It really doesn't, because it falls directly in line with the goddess that is being honored on that day, with all of the symbology behind her and everything. It has nothing to do with the Christian God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Okay? The God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, his feast days it's not on Easter. It's Passover, unleavened bread, Feast of First Fruits, Shavuot, Feast of Trumpets, Yom Kippur, Sukkot, the 7 feasts that the world doesn't recognize. Very few honor it. The Jewish people have maintained it over time, but we got to get back to the biblical roots of doing Bible things in Bible ways. That's my spiel as a Christian and somebody who loves to honor the Lord by doing what His Word says. And I want to encourage you guys to do that as well. And if you're interested in learning more, stick along for the ride. I will share more about these feast days that God ordained in His Word as the time comes up to observe them in 2024.